Hey again. This is our last section on the tensions about crossing cultures, and this one we're going to focus on tensions regarding vulnerability. Um, this is another one of those that is a little bit more difficult to explain, and it's another one of these that I would say have a wider amount of variation within a culture, even though certain cultures are more what we call concealment cultures and some are more exposure cultures. Within a culture, you can have people that fit quite a bit in most extremes. As usual, though, there are some differences on the continuum. Um, the most extreme concealment cultures, the cultures that are not willing to be open and vulnerable, tend to be those in the Far East. They are very, very guarded about how much they open themselves up, how much risk they would take and such for fear of failure. Whereas you move to the other end of the spectrum, and like Europe and the US, we're more exposure cultures. We have more of a tendency to open up and take risks and put ourselves out there for the possibility of success or failure. The Middle East and many of the other parts of the world, including Africa, South America, a lot of those countries kind of fall somewhere in the middle of the continuum. But remember, this is a continuum. This is not that there's just one extreme or another. All of us tend to land somewhere on this concealment exposure continuum. And like many of the other issues that we've discussed, we might be more concealment on certain issues and more exposure on other issues. So it's not just a yes/no question. It's more of a sliding scale of where we fit on there. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by this. What does it mean? What is this tension regarding vulnerability? Comparisons. A concealment culture is very focused on the protection of self-image and avoiding being wrong. A concealment culture is quieter, shall we say, because in a concealment-based or concealment-focused culture, people don't want to put themselves out there. They don't want to say something. They don't want to do something. They don't want to take a particular position for fear of the fact that that might be discovered to be wrong. And if it's discovered to be wrong, that would do harm to their self-image and to their image in society. And so they're more willing to be quiet and sit back and wait and withhold anything that they might say. And so that's what a concealment culture does. Where an exposure culture just expect error and failure to be normal and expected, as a matter of fact. Failure and error are expected. Once again, America, USA is very much an exposure culture. We believe that failure is not just normal, it's necessary. We would say things like, if you've never failed, that means you've never tried anything hard enough yet. If you miss 100% of the shots that you never take, things like that. Shoot for the moon, and even if you miss it, you'll be among the stars. All those kind of silly sayings that we have nowadays. But we believe that you ought to take the chance and make sure that you are doing what you got to do. And even if you fail, make sure you fail big. Go big or go home. You see how an exposure culture is all about putting yourself out there. And even if you don't succeed, people are going to be happy with you because you tried. A concealment culture isn't like that. A concealment culture wants to protect their self-image. They don't want to be seen as being wrong. They don't want to be seen as having tried something and failed. And as I said, understand, this is not good versus bad, good versus evil, right versus wrong. These are two different ways of viewing the world. Both of these ways exist, and as coming from a culture that is pretty high on the exposure of vulnerability scale, we have to be careful not to superimpose our views onto those who come from a concealment culture, because as far as they're concerned, we're being foolish, we're being rash, we're being taking unnecessary chances, and embarrassing ourselves, embarrassing our families and such. And so this idea of concealment and exposure is really seen. This could really be seen especially in a classroom setting. If you were teaching in the Far East, if you were in China or if you were in Japan or somewhere else in the Far East and you were teaching a class, you ask a question, it is very likely that no one will answer. It's very likely that no one will give you an answer because they are waiting for you, the content expert, to provide them with what the answer ought to be. They don't want to risk answering a question and then be found out to have been wrong, be found out to have been misled, misconstrued, and that would hurt their self-image and hurt their self-respect. That would cause them to lose face, is the terminology that is used often in these type of discussions. Whereas in our Western classrooms, I want my students to answer, and I want them to take a risk. And even if they're not completely right, their partial rightness helps me to know what further I need to teach. And so we build our classrooms and our classroom interactions around this idea that people need to expose be vulnerable and take the risk. And so understand, though, that's not normative in about half of the world. So a concealment culture would emphasize the quality of performance, whereas an exposure culture emphasizes the completion of the task. The concealment culture, man, it's about doing it perfectly. Not just getting the job done, but doing it perfectly, doing it ideally. And once again, you can see some of this evidence in, for instance, some art thing. You look at Eastern art. You look at these beautiful vases. You look at these beautiful paintings. You look at these beautiful. The Eastern art is all about perfection and precision, fine, detailed lines and perfect perspectives and ideal color mixtures, and they want it to be absolutely perfect, absolutely right. Whereas in an exposure culture, we just want to get the job done. And we often, we have silly phrases like, well, that's close enough for government work. In other words, may not be great, but we got the job done. Now we can move on to the next task. And so, once again, quality over performance compared to the completion of a task. We're willing to take a shot at not being perfect by getting the job done. And I will say that that's something that, once again, there are people within our culture that are on both sides of this, and we often have struggles within a situation. My language acquisition is an illustration of this. My wife tends to be more of a perfectionist, and she wants to do things well if she's going to do them at all. And I am more of a just throw it out there and see if it works type person, and throw the spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. Therefore, when we began learning language, from day one, I was out talking to people, even with the 14 words I knew and one verb conjugation I knew. I was out talking to people and carrying on conversations and doing everything I could, making all kind of stupid mistakes. I could list for you the mistakes that I made. Terry was more quiet. She didn't want to discuss. She didn't want to talk to people as much until she knew how to correctly conjugate the verbs and how to correctly put the endings on the words and such. Now, in reality, by the end, we both learned the language. I became more conversational in the language. She became more of an expert in the grammar. And so we were able to balance each other out, especially when it came to putting things in writing. I would always have to consult her about what ending to put on a word, because I knew how to say it, but I didn't know if it was the U ending or the A ending that needed to go on a certain word. So even there, we have that difference between the concealment of vulnerability and the exposure of vulnerability, and how these two things, how people can react to those type of things. A concealment culture will have a reluctance to enter the unknown. They don't want to try new things. Why would I try a new thing? I might not be good at it. Why would I try a new thing? It might not be something that is good for me, that is good for my family, or good for my self-image. I want to stay with what I know, and I want to become excellent as what I know. I want to do one thing, and I want to do it very, very well. Whereas an exposure culture, we tend to be well, we want to try new things. We're always interested. Well, I'd be willing to try that. Yeah, I've never actually tried cooking a 47-step recipe before, but hey, what's the worst that could happen? I'm going to try this 47-step recipe, and it turns into something horrible, and you burn down your kitchen. But hey, it's exciting. Let's try something new. We also tend to be, and this is another American phrase, we tend to be jack of all trades and master of none. Jack of all trades is a old phrase of referring to a person who can do a lot of things. They can't do any of them at a mastery level, but they can do a lot of things, and we honor that idea. The idea of being a person. I mean, my dad can do electrical, he can do cabinetry, he can do low voltage electrical, he can do sound, he can do and he can, and actually he's a master in the carpentry areas. However, I can do all of those things as well, but I'm not a master in any of them. My only area of mastery is in intercultural studies and in teaching. That's the two things that I'm really good at. But I can do 47 other things. And so we like new opportunities and like trying things, whereas a concealment culture is more reluctant about those type of things. Again, I want to point out, I'm not saying that concealment cultures are bad. I'm just describing the differences between the two. Don't get the idea that I'm saying that we ought to be more exposure or less concealment. It may sound that way because I'm talking about my personal preferences, but concealment cultures are valid, and they're how whole nations operate. And so just this once again, this is about you understanding that these different ideas exist, and when you meet with them, when you confront these ideas and you're around them, that you're not overwhelmed by why in the world are they behaving this way. Well, they're behaving this way because they have been taught to conceal vulnerability. It's how their brains operate. It's what their mind is wanting to do. A concealment culture, once again, has a tendency to withdraw from something to hide weakness. If they are trying something and they discover that they're not going to be able to do it perfectly, they would have a tendency to withdraw, pull back, and not show that they're unable to finish the task. Whereas an exposure culture, we readily admit to our weaknesses and we try to push through them. That's just the idea. We will see somebody who try to do something and fail, and we say, "Good job, you tried. Now you looked horrible and you've had absolute failure, but you tried. Hooray for you." A concealment culture doesn't see it that way. A concealment culture says, "Why did you continue to try to do that? You embarrassed yourself. Focus on the things that you can do well, and don't embarrass yourself by trying this thing and showing that you're weak at it." And so, as I said, these are totally different ways of thinking. Concealment cultures are not open to criticism, are open to allowing people to look into their personal life, whereas a exposure culture doesn't tend to take criticism personally and tends to reveal our personal life. There are several case studies that I've read that really point this out, and this is an area. This is one of the areas I'm talking about. The first one, the one in a classroom setting. Another area that really shows this concealment versus exposure of vulnerability has to do with a job environment. In a job environment in the U.S., the exposure culture, we expect about once a year to have someone do an overview, an assessment of our job, a job review. We expect that there's going to be somebody who's going to sit down with us and talk about what we did well and talk about what we didn't do as well, and here are the 4 areas that you need to improve on this next year, and here's some, there's some criticism about this type of thing, but we literally expect that. As a matter of fact, we almost don't take something seriously if all we get is good feedback. If all we get is good feedback, we wonder, are you looking at my job? Are you looking at what I'm doing? If you get, let's say you're taking a class and you're writing a paper every week, and on every paper all you get is 100, 100, 100, 100, you might think, are they even grading these? Are they just writing in grades? They're not making any comments about doing well or doing poorly? And I've gone so far sometimes as to write in a little short paper and say, if you're actually reading this paper, send me an email letting me know. And one time a professor did. I am reading your papers, you're just doing well. And I had some other times some professors never even respond to it, which means they're just putting a gradient. So we tend to expect some level of criticism, and if we're not seeing some helpful hints or some some ideas for how to better improve ourselves, we wonder about it. In a concealment culture, you don't do that. There are multiple stories, and I said multiple case studies, in which a situation has arisen where you have a Westerner who is the department leader, the boss of a group of Eastern workers, and when it comes time for their annual review or whatever else, and the worker comes in and sits down, and the Western person begins to do what they typically do, which is they say here are the 3 things you do well, and here's the 3 criticisms, or here are 3 negative things that have been found about your work. It's crushed the people. You've caused them to lose face. You've said that I am not being excellent in my performance. You've attacked my core being. And there have been people who've literally left corporations, left businesses, became very angry and shut down because of these type of criticisms. The reality is, if you have a criticism in an Eastern culture, you don't go straight to the person. You would talk to someone who would serve as a go-between between you and that other person, who would gently come to that other person and say, the boss has made some statements that they would prefer that you begin answering the phone more quickly and not allowing phone calls to go through to the voicemail or whatever else. They really want us to answer the phone anytime that we can. And then the person is able to say, oh yes, I can see that. I will be happy to make that change. And the go-between goes back to the boss and says, I've spoken with them and they said that they will make that change. You've allowed the person to not lose face. And I know our American brains just explode with that. My American brain says, no, you told somebody else something bad about me and they had to come. What do you mean? That's because we're exposure culture. We want to deal with things head on. And this actually has to do with the issue of how we handle conflict as well. We think you have to handle it head on and don't bring somebody else in the discussion. But that's because we're an exposure culture. I'm willing to hear the criticism. I'm willing to hear what you have to say about me. And I'm willing to argue it with you or agree with you and decide to change. I'm willing to do that. Concealment culture doesn't work that way. So as I said, be careful, be aware when you're crossing cultures, especially into a concealment of vulnerability culture, that you don't do things that would cause people to lose face and cause them to be overwhelmed by these feelings of loss that they experience. It's a really, as I said, this is one of the bigger challenges because it's somewhat invisible to us. We don't necessarily see these particular things. I'm going to have to add one more lecture here to the end and just wrap up this section. I hope these have been useful to you. As always, feel free to send me an email if you have questions, need clarification, or if you happen to have a fantastic illustration of something that you've dealt with a situation like that. I always appreciate new illustrations as well.